All right, folks, good afternoon. I'm not sure if you heard that first piece here. I realized that my microphone was a little bit on mute here, so I apologize for the delay in getting started. But welcome everybody to our January 2018 webinar. I wanted just to take the opportunity to thank everybody for taking the time out of their schedule to jump on board here. My name is Jeff Yeagley with Compass IT Compliance, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. Just wanted to go over a few quick items before I turn the presentation over to Pat Hughes, who will be presenting on incident response today. A couple quick things. If everybody could please do me a favor and make sure that you mute your lines. We just want to minimize any type of background noise and distractions for Pat while he's presenting. That'd be great. Second thing is that we will be recording this webinar and making this available on our website and our YouTube channel later this afternoon. So in case you want to pass it on to any colleagues, friends, or coworkers, you can feel free to do so. So you will all receive an email from me with that information. In addition, I will also be sending out a copy of the presentation as well. So you can look for that again later this afternoon. If you have any questions, we will have some time for a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. There's a chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. You can go ahead and you can type your question in there and we can get to those time permitting. So we're scheduled for about 30 minutes today. I'm going to turn it over to Pat Hughes. Let me introduce him real quick here. So Pat Hughes is one of our IT auditors with Compass, has extensive experience working in a number of different vertical markets with clients of all varying sizes, whether it's PCI risk assessments, incident response. He's done some work with the NIST 800-171 government assessments for controlled unclassified information. So Pat brings extensive experience to Compass and to this presentation. So I'm excited to see what he has to say, and I'm sure you guys will get a ton of value out of the presentation. So without further ado, I will transition it over to Pat.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. I just want to confirm that you can hear me all right.
Sure can, buddy.
Okay, awesome. All right, guys, thanks for coming to the webinar today. So as discussed, it's going to be on incident response, and we'll just dive right into it. So first off, here's the agenda for today. We're just going to go over what is incident response, the components of an incident response program, that being the policies, procedures, the plan itself, testing, training, maintaining, educating that incident response team so that you're prepared for when an incident does occur. Because sadly, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when in the world we live in today. And then just, the responsibilities of the people on that incident response team so that everyone knows their role in the incident and what they're supposed to execute in order to be functioning at a high level when an incident does occur. And then just the elements of the actual incident response plan itself. That'll be the meat and potatoes of the plan. We'll dive into that as well. So first off, what is incident response? You hear the term thrown around a lot. Some people confuse it with business continuity or disaster recovery. It's really its own separate thing. So incident response, it's really the aftermath of a security breach. It all comes down to time and money. We want to limit the time that our systems are down. We also want to limit the cost. So it's more so an organized approach to addressing and managing the aftermath of a security breach or an attack, or even a perceived attack. Even if it's not a full-blown incident, things should always be documented. That way we have something to go back on and potential lessons learned and to update our plan and make changes. Detection of an incident itself is huge. This can be paramount if you're at your own workstation and something doesn't feel right, your system's running slow, you're getting all these crazy pop-ups. It's better to say something than rather not to say something. We want to make sure we are proactive in this. So you want to make sure you're going through the appropriate channels to report to your boss and let them know that, hey, something doesn't feel right, and maybe it's just the system's running slow and that's just the extent of it. But it's better to report it and then to have to deal with an incident later. As I said previous, it all comes down to recovery time and cost. We want to limit the cost by isolating whatever system is affected. We want to minimize the time that we're down, because the more time we're down, that's less time we're doing business, and nobody wants that. So moving right along. This is a quote that I think, incident. If you fail to plan planning to fail. I don't think there's anything, that's more true than that when it comes to incident response. If we have a plan in place and our team members of the incident response team know what they're doing when a certain incident occurs, we're going to be sharp, we're going to be ready to go, and we're going to be able to minimize the downtime and the cost, and that's where it all comes back to. Incident response program. So, the biggest thing is, why do we need an incident response program? It all comes down to, again, time and money. We want to save time and money in the event of an incident by facilitating an organized response to minimize the impact of the event. We want to make sure our people know what to do in the event of an incident. So there's no panic. We all execute what we're told, what it says on our plan, and also, a system that is connected to a network, you got to isolate that immediately, and that's huge. Make sure Wi-Fi is turned off, so you're essentially on an island, so no other systems are being affected. It's kind of like the whole stop the bleeding thing. When an incident occurs, you get a ransomware on your machine. It can spread to other machines in the network if we don't take the appropriate actions, and we won't know what appropriate actions to take if we don't have those documented in the plan, and the plan should be readily available to everyone on that incident response team. Another reason that a lot of these companies are interested in an incident response plan is just simply because they're told they must, through PCI DSS, which is a standard, as well as HIPAA High-Tech, ISO, and GLBA. A lot of these standards and best practices require an incident response plan, so that's another great reason to do that, so you can comply with these. So what actually goes into the plan? It's the policies, procedures, and the plan. The policies and procedures are what we say we're going to do when an incident occurs. It's important to have these documented ahead of time. That way the appropriate people know what they're doing. So, if it says X person does X, Y, and Z when such and such occurs, they know exactly what their role is, and they don't have to worry about what everyone else is doing. They can focus strictly on what they have to execute. That way we can get back to functioning. Training and education, it's huge. It's important to, security awareness training, so that your employees are aware of, just from the first step to not clicking on a certain link, so we avoid this altogether. But then when it comes back to the plan itself, we want to train and educate on the plan. Even people that aren't involved to a fuller extent should know who's doing what. That way, they can help out if needed, which is huge. And then, importantly, testing of the plan, tabletop testing to even like a full-blown scenario that you would run through. And just to kind of go over those different levels of testing, the first one would be a tabletop test. That's where your whole incident response team and important members of the organization kind of sit down around a table and talk about a certain incident. Usually a scenario is devised, and you'll go over, okay, if this were to happen, how would we react? And you'd be surprised at how many things you kind of overlook when you're typing it up, and you're putting it in your policy and procedures that we would do such and such. And then when you're sitting there with 10, 12 people around the table and you're talking through an incident, it's crazy to see all the things that have been overlooked. So it's a really good practice, and I think every time that I've done one of these with an organization, there are countless things that are just small, minor things that are overlooked, but it makes the difference to save time when an incident does occur. And as I keep saying, and you're going to get sick of me saying it, is it all comes back to the time and money, and that's what's important here. The next level of the testing would be a simulation test. That's kind of where you're simulating the incident itself in the business, but we're not going to the full-blown testing part where we're adding vendors to the scenario, and we're actually shutting systems down. So a simulation is kind of like a walkthrough of that tabletop, if you will. And then the next one would be like a parallel. So that's where we're involving some vendors, and we're letting them know, hey, we're doing an incident response test. This is going to happen. We need you to do this, and you kind of let them know ahead of time. But we're taking that next step, and we're going to kind of act out that scenario that we devised. And then finally is the full-blown incident itself. You're not informing the vendors, you're not informing your people. Maybe key folks know about it, the test that's about to occur. But we're doing that full-blown test, and we're seeing how our people react. Now, when it comes to something like this and doing this, it's not very common to do, and it's not always recommended because it actually can cause an incident, and we've seen that before. So that's kind of maybe after all years of the other testing have been done and solidified, maybe that's something to explore, but it's not really recommended. The important thing with the testing is to kind of mature the testing over the years. So if we go into an organization and for the past 10 years they've been doing tabletop tests, they have it down to the back of their hand there. But you want to make sure that you're maturing the test so that we get more experience. If you've mastered the tabletop test, let's start doing simulation testing. You never have to go to that full-blown level, but let's mature the test a little bit. We'll add different elements. We'll add different vendors to make sure that we really know what we're doing and we're well-rounded in our incident response plan. And then finally, it's important to make sure that we're maintaining and updating the plan as needed. As people are coming and going throughout the business, we're going to need to change those titles, those roles, who can handle what based on different skill sets. And then even, through other scenarios that have occurred and lessons learned, we want to make sure we're updating the plan as needed. If we say we're doing it a certain way and an incident occurs and we find out, hey, that maybe isn't the best way to do it, we're going to go back and we're going to change that in the plan. That way we best reflect the plan for the next scenario. And then just the responsibilities of the incident response team. Larger organizations are going to have a full-blown incident response team that's dedicated strictly to incident response. Now that's not always the case, and it's not common at all, because that's very costly to have a kind of a standby team on the bench, if you will, to be ready for an incident to occur. That's extremely costly because they're very skilled individuals that are responding to these things. So that's not always an option. But as long as your people know what their role is, and what they're capable of, it's important to not try to ask them to do too much. You want to recognize their skill set and what they can perform, and let's give them a role that they can excel in. If you don't have that and it's not really available, outsourcing is always an option, and that's a great option to take. Have somebody else kind of walk through your plan and build your plan with you, and then you can even outsource if something was to occur. You kind of let someone else handle it. And some people would rather do it that way. Obviously, there's cost to that as well, but it's definitely worth it to save your organization from an incident. And then here are listed some different titles in an incident response plan. Incident response officer, incident response assessment team. Don't focus too much on the titles. The titles don't matter as much. It's more so about the role that they're playing. We can call them different things. It doesn't matter too much. But we want to make sure the role is defined and that whoever is in that role understands what their role is in the event of an incident. And then just kind of an overview of the plan and the program itself. Preparing, that's huge. That's developing our policies and procedures that I talked about, educating our staff to make sure they're aware, and then letting them know what the appropriate actions are when something were to occur. And then next would be identifying, and that's when an incident occurs. We need to identify it immediately. That's huge. So as I talked about before, you want your team to know, hey, something doesn't feel right. Let's report it and let's get after it and get a step ahead of the process here. Also, in the identify aspect would be like things like system alerts. Let's make sure we're staying on top of those so that we're ready in case an incident does occur. Next part, is containing. So once we know, hey, we have an incident, we need to contain that. And as I talked about before, maybe unplugging certain systems and isolating them. That's a huge factor to kind of stop the bleeding, as I mentioned earlier. We want to contain that incident and make sure that it doesn't spread throughout the network. Getting off Wi-Fi, things like that. And again, you want your trained individuals to kind of handle that. It shouldn't just be your receptionist or someone that's not trained in that, pulling the plugs around the office to try to isolate. That's not always the best route to take. And then moving on to eradicating, and that would be to get rid of whatever the incident was. And we want to make sure we clean it all out. We want to gather all the evidence and piece together everything to make sure that we have a high level view of what exactly happened and how we can avoid it in the future. And then recovering is getting all our systems and our applications back online. And that's huge as well. to make sure that we're running, back to normal. And it's, you want to monitor those systems even for the next week or so after to make sure everything seems back to normal and we're functioning again properly. And then after actions review is sort of like a lessons learned. What did we learn from that incident? How can we be better next time? Let's document everything. Let's make changes to the plan as needed. If everything went well and we felt like we handled it perfectly, that's great. Let's document that. Still, everything should be documented. And then just moving right along here. Oh, I think I skipped one here. Oh, sorry. Okay, and then, preparing. And we're going to hit on all those different bubbles that I kind of just summarized real quickly, but more in depth here. So, preparing. Large organizations have a digital forensics firm, like Compass or another firm that you feel comfortable with, kind of on a retainer in the event of an incident. And educating your people on the incident response team, is huge, and that's our first line of defense. If we have people that aren't educated on security awareness and general security, and they're over there clicking on links, hey, you want a free iPhone, click, and then boom, there's an incident right there. And we want to avoid all those things. And the easiest way to do that, and it's not costly at all, is to just educate our people, educate our team, let them know what to look out for, what to avoid. If something doesn't feel right, talk to someone and let them know who they can talk to, so that we can avoid an incident like this. And that kind of ties back into, the next bullet there, identification of different types of incidents. As I spoke about before, Nancy or whoever is at her desk and her system's running slow, it doesn't feel right, it's not exactly like it was the past few months, notify someone. It's better to notify someone than not to notify someone. We don't want to, kind of let anything slip through. And then how she should respond, and that goes back to being proactive and letting the appropriate person know, and through proper reporting channels is, hey, if something doesn't feel right, talk to X, Y, and Z, talk to this person, let them know, and they'll handle it. And we don't want to be negligent about those things, and we don't want to, kind of tell her, oh, it's fine, look into it, because it could save you time and money in the long run. Okay, and then identifying critical systems and potential targets. This is another big factor, because if we know what could potentially be targeted, we can take the appropriate steps to be more secure in those areas. What's more vulnerable to like a ransomware attack? We want to identify our critical systems, and we want to put more security around those systems. Another big thing is doing backups. If you can back up nightly, if you can back up throughout the day, that's huge. If we can back up and then, we have an incident, we can restore to those backups and save lots of time, lots of money, lots of stress and hassle. So things like that are always great to do. Another thing is I kind of touched on this earlier, is understanding what we have and what we don't have. What is our skill set here? If we're a small doctor's office and we have 3 employees, well, maybe we don't really have a team, to be on that incident response team. We don't have someone that's educated in those areas. And HIPAA High Tech, as I touched on earlier, looks for an incident response program. And I've been in countless organizations where it's, a very small business, a 1 or 2 person show, and they simply don't have the means to do it. And that's where you're looking for, outsourcing or having somebody come in and help you out. But, they might overlook it. But as I keep touching on, it's not something you want to overlook. It can be extremely costly. It can be extremely threatening to the business if you don't have the appropriate knowledge to kind of handle it the right way. Another example, when it comes to knowledge of a situation that I've dealt with, is a client of ours that, they had an incident and they were so quick to report it, and that can be detrimental to the business. If you have an incident and you were breached, it's important. You're not obligated to report it right away. You don't need to go to the attorney generals and report it right away and say, hey, we were compromised, all this was out. Let's find out what was compromised and if we even were compromised. Because in that scenario, they were so quick to jump on it and say, hey, we were compromised. It was in the newspapers, and that can be so devastating to a business. And then it turns out hey, maybe we weren't, they weren't as compromised as they thought. All the things they listed that were compromised weren't. So it's important to figure out what exactly the scenario is. And that comes back to education. If they knew that they didn't have to report right away, and you don't, you need to find out all the information first. And that's, kind of like Equifax that we've all heard about. They were sitting on it for about a year, which, was too long. But at the same time, you don't need to come out right away and scream, "Hey, we were breached," because that can be extremely harmful. So you want to hire the appropriate people to come in and assess the situation. That's kind of the moral of the story there. And then moving right along here. Oops, sorry. It comes back to practicing, as I talked about earlier, testing, making diverse scenarios so that everyone feels comfortable in different scenarios that we have. Everyone should know their role and their responsibility on the incident response team. This person does this when this happens. It should all be documented. That way there's no guessing. We want to take all the guessing out of it, so when something happens, we can execute immediately. Everyone can get to their stations and kind of perform their duties to make sure we limit time and money. And those are the two factors here when it comes to incident response. Moving right along to identify system alerts and event logs are a great way. However, that's not always going to pick it up. It's not going to say, "Hey, we've been compromised, shut everything down." It is a great tool, and it's great to have, as well as automated notifications, different resources and testing things we can do. But again, these are not 100%, so we want to make sure we're doing everything we can, and those would be things we can do. But also back to the education and our people as our first line of defense, letting them know to come out and say something if something doesn't feel right. And even if you were to click on a link and it still seems fine, everything's running smoothly, but you still feel indifferent about it and it doesn't feel right, still let somebody know. We can check on it. You don't want to sit there and say, "Hey, I came back 3 days later and everything still feels fine." It may not show itself immediately. So we want to take all the appropriate action. Containing. Classification of data, we want to find out what kind of data was compromised. There's different levels of data, from anything that's open to the public to limited and even restricted. We want to know what data was compromised, and this goes back to my little story there of them saying, "Hey, we were compromised. This was all leaked." We want to find out exactly what was compromised before we take any additional steps. Also, what systems were compromised, what types of systems. That's important because it could be a highly available system. We want to understand what the cost of isolating that system can be. When I say you got to isolate it and pull the plug on the system, that may not always be the case. If it's our system that if it's like a bad example here would be like the stock market or something. If you unplug that system, that's detrimental to everything. That's huge. But kind of think about that in a lesser aspect in your organization. What is your key systems? Take this offline for 10 minutes. How big is that impact going to be? So you that comes back to having the appropriate people to make those judgment calls and to get your business back functioning in the appropriate way. And when it comes to quarantining the scenario itself, that's huge as well. And like I said, stop the bleeding, isolating those systems. And again, we want to make sure we have the appropriate people to take the appropriate actions to do those systems. And that should all be in our plan. All right, and then the eradication of it. We want to use all the evidence at our disposal to understand how this scenario happened or how this incident happened. This is intended, for trained individuals, digital forensics examiners. Think of it as putting, like a crime scene together. We want to see this is how they got in, this is what was compromised, this is what they took. There could still be things of that attack still in our system, on our machines, removing the malicious code, patching systems. These are all great ways to go about getting the recovery aspect ready. But the biggest thing is to keep all that evidence and document everything. We want to know exactly how it happened so we can avoid this in the future. If we can find out how the threat got in, we can fix that and prevent it from happening again. Next would be the recovery. Making sure we can get those systems and software back online is huge. It's the essential aspect to our business here. Is our systems in many cases. So getting those back online in a timely manner, and at the least cost is really what it comes down to. Verification of a remediated state, keep the original gap closed. We want to make sure that we know everything's back running normally, and we want to monitor those for, as I said before, the weeks to come, and make sure, hey, everything is back to normal. If something doesn't feel right, let's go back, let's investigate, let's use all that evidence that I had talked about, let's put the crime scene together, get the appropriate people in there, digital forensics examiners, to kind of image the system and piece that all together. And that's kind of the last bullet there, the monitoring period. Validate that what we did actually worked for remediation, and document any signs of weakness. And then, the after action review is sort of basically, as I touched on, a lessons learned. When this incident happened, how did we respond? Did we feel like we did a good job? What could we work on? Each person should document what they did, the steps they took, and let's match that up to the plan and our policies, and the procedures there. Let's see what we said we were going to do. Let's see if we did it. Let's see how it worked. Let's close those gaps, and let's document that and give it to the appropriate people to make updates to the plan, so that we know in the future, where we need to put more effort, where we need to make changes, so that, in the event of the next incident, we can really, take it head on, and everyone will feel comfortable in their role. So it's an always evolving plan and program. And, back to education and training, that's, again, always evolving. There's always new threats to look out for. It's just, the nature of the beast. So you got to stay on top of that. We got to stay on top of educating our people, let them know. Things like that are the best way, to get ahead of the incident. But keeping everything documented and being aware of what we need to do, and making sure our incident response team knows what they need to do in the event of an incident, is the biggest way to save A, time, B, money. Those are the two big things here that we care about. And then just, in summary here, before an incident, make sure that the program is in place, make sure we all know about it. Education and training, I keep touching on that, it's huge. Making sure our people know what to do. Testing, back to that tabletop testing, let's walk through a scenario. If something were to happen, how would we go about it? During the incident, time is of the essence, it really is. And the more time you're down, the more costly it is to your business. Report any incident or perceived threat. It's back to my whole spiel about, if something feels like it's not right, it probably isn't. Let's report it to the appropriate people, and let's take those actions. Involving the appropriate technical resources, digital forensics examiners, outsourcing IT, whatever you need to do to make sure that you have those resources when something does go wrong, because something will go wrong, as I keep referring to, because it's just the world we live in today. We want to make sure we have that team behind us to feel secure when something like this happens. After the incident, analyze what happened. Let's gather all that evidence, kind of like that crime scene that I talked about. Let's put everything together. Let's see how it happened. Let's see how we can prevent it from happening again. And then just additional resources, NIST, frameworks, SANS. And that'll conclude the presentation. I'm going to turn it back over to Jeff here and see if there's any questions.
Pat, great job, man. Thanks for sharing all that. I think this is such an important topic for a variety of reasons, because as you mentioned earlier in the presentation, it's not, we don't want to use scare tactics, but the reality is it's not a matter of if something's going to happen, it's going to be a matter of when something is going to happen. And that could be something as simple as someone clicking on a link, or a targeted attack from outside influences, or whatever the case might be. So important to kind of have that roadmap to know who does what, when, where, why, and how, really. So great job, man. Thanks for sharing all of that information. I'm going to open it up to some questions now. I had a couple that were emailed over to me. There's one in the chat box here.
Sure.
So let's go through a couple of these here, and we can get these answered up. Let's see. So the first one we'll do is, how often should an organization test their incident response plan?
That's great. Most regulation standards, best practices recommend at least annual testing of the plan. Some organizations dealing with highly sensitive information, you may be required to do more testing, but annual testing of the plan, anything from that tabletop that I touched on to, simulation testing, it can be done annually. Obviously, if you can do it biannually, that's better. The more the better. Obviously, it's not always feasible. We can't get everyone to sit around a table all day, or we got a business to run, so that's not always an option. But at least annual testing of the plan is definitely recommended and is best practice.
Awesome. Yeah, it's so true, especially, I mean, threats change, circumstances change, personnel changes, right? So getting everybody on the same page I don't want you're right, people have other jobs and responsibilities, but, you know, it's so important to understand when an incident or a perceived incident happens, the time that you take to respond can make a big difference in what the outcome of that event is. So,
Exactly.
and the only way to do that is practice, right? For sure. So,
Right.
good stuff, man. All right, question two um, kind of falls in line with question one. How would I go about starting to test our incident response plan?
Okay, sure. First off, I think it's huge to make sure that you have the appropriate plan in place. So when you feel comfortable with your plan, that's step one. Let's get our plan in place. Let's train our people. Let's make sure everyone knows what they're doing in the event of an incident, and make sure they're comfortable with it. That's huge. Next would be to start testing the plan. I would recommend, that tabletop test that I keep talking about. Let's come up with a scenario, a scenario that would be, X, Y, and Z happens. There's an incident. How are we going to react? Let's come up with diverse scenarios, and we'll kind of work through those to make sure that we feel comfortable with them. So that would be the route I would take. Is to come up with that scenario, get everyone around a table. Let's talk through that scenario. If this happens, how would we react? And then you'll start to realize, like I talked about earlier, we go into all these places, and the little things are overlooked. Maybe you didn't document a certain line of communication, and now important people aren't aware of what step of the plan we're on. It's the little things like that to make sure everyone's on the same page and functioning at a high level when an incident does occur.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I worked with a client. This is probably about a year and a half ago, and some of the questions that they were asking were kind of like those little things, right? And this is kind of just at the beginning of the ransomware explosion. And their question was, one of the questions we need to answer is how would we even go about getting a Bitcoin, right? If we had to pay a ransom and we had to do that,
Yeah.
who would be responsible to do that? Which is a great question because not a lot of organizations may at that time have thought about that. And again, who does what when, and that can be the difference between I don't want to say a quick recovery because that's not really the right word, but uh,
An effective recovery.
an effective recovery, exactly, reducing that time and money that it's going to take to recover from the incident for sure.
Exactly.
All right, another question here.
Sure.
During the presentation, you had mentioned having a digital forensics firm on retainer. How does that process work? Um, yeah, how does that process work?
Yeah, typically, it's like a certain fee that you pay for that retainer based on, the complexity of your business. However, if you have an incident, obviously that fee would be applied to that incident, and the digital forensic firm would come in and kind of support you in that regard, and that fee would be applied. It's kind of similar to how law firms do it, if you will. So yeah, I hope that helps there.
Yeah, absolutely. So good stuff. And yeah, having someone that you can kind of call in as opposed to trying to figure it out is a great part of your plan for sure. Because again, getting those resources in a timely fashion can mean the difference between an effective or a prolonged recovery. So good stuff. We have another question that came in here, and I'm going to read this, and then I'm going to share a couple pieces of information that I heard, and Pat, I'll let you, of course, contribute as well.
Sure.
So the question that came in was, how does incident response planning relate with a business continuity plan? Should incident response planning be a part of the business continuity plan? So we just did a conference a couple weeks back down here in Florida, and we gave a similar presentation on incident response and covered a bunch of different pieces. And one of the pieces that we talked about was exactly this question, right? How does incident response planning relate to business continuity planning? And the answer that was given by Jerry Hughes, one of our executive IT auditors and managing partners, was they're separate plans, right? Your incident response is going to deal with the threats or perceived threats. Business continuity deals with the shutdown of businesses due to whatever, any type of natural disaster event. But your incident response plan can trigger your business continuity plan, which was kind of interesting. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. If you have some type of security incident and you're taking systems offline, as you alluded to, Pat, in the presentation, you're in effect triggering your business continuity plan because you're taking systems offline and you need to figure out how you're going to continue your business operations with those systems offline until they can be effectively restored, and the threat or risk is remediated or eliminated. So I don't know if you have anything you want to share on that, but that was a great question that came in, and something that we just covered a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point that Jerry brings up, that your incident response plan can trigger your plan. Because as I talked about before, in a scenario where something goes wrong, if we have somebody running around that's uneducated, shutting down all different kinds of systems, that can be detrimental to everything our business does. So by having the appropriate plan in place and making sure our people know what to do, we can avoid things like that because it can kind of be like a snowball effect, to where we're busting out the BCP plan and all, everything hits the fan, if you will. So that wouldn't be good. So I think that's a great point that he brought up there.
Yeah, it's definitely good stuff. And to take it a kind of a step further too, in preparing for that conference and some other things that we've been doing, some of the different compliance regulations, and specifically when you look at the FFIEC IT handbooks, and I'll even break out my inner technology geek here, and I'll break it down to quote Appendix J of the Business Continuity Planning one talks about incident response. So in some compliance requirements, they still sort of look at those as being similar yet different, and they also, to kind of play into the last question that was asked about digital forensics retainers, they strongly advise in that appendix for organizations, obviously in this case specifically financial institutions, to have an incident response plan and also have a trusted third-party forensics firm on retainer to be able to respond effectively and quickly to any type of uh, incident that occurs. So, kind of interesting how
Yeah,
they all
I
kind of
think
tie together.
that's a great point there, Jeff. To make sure you have, and I kept saying it throughout the thing. And I'm sorry to be a broken record here, but to have the appropriate resources such as that digital forensics retainer, to have the appropriate people to piece that evidence together, can be paramount in restoring the business in a timely manner. So I think that's a great point. To have the appropriate resources behind you so that you feel comfortable as a business owner.
Absolutely. Nope, that makes perfect sense. I'll do last call here for any questions. If you have any, pop them into that chat box there. I'll give another couple seconds here while we start to wrap things up. Pat, I want to take the opportunity just to say thank you for taking the time to not only present the information to us, but also to prepare in advance for this. I know you have a lot of clients that you work with, so I appreciate you taking the time, as I'm sure everybody who attended today is very appreciative of you taking the time to go over this, because again, I think it's very important in terms of the threat landscape that's out there today.
Of
Uh,
course, yep.
I want to thank everybody that took the time out of their day to go ahead and attend. I know we ran a little bit over the time, but I appreciate you, and I know Pat appreciates everybody taking the time out again to learn more about this very important topic and how we can benefit and assist organizations in developing these plans moving forward. Because again, being prepared is essential for these types of incidents that occur moving forward. So, as I mentioned earlier, we did record this, so I'll be sending this out to everybody that registered later this afternoon, along with a copy of the presentation. So that way, you guys have any questions, Pat's contact information, as you can see on the screen, is there. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to either him or I directly. And then next month, we're going to discuss, kind of playing off of incident response and piggybacking on that, next month's webinar at the end of February, date to be determined. We'll have that listed out the first week of February, is going to be on digital forensics and the components of forensics, and what that process looks like, and what steps you should take in going through that process to make sure that you're prepared. Um, with that, Pat, thank you. I don't see any other questions in here, so I think you
Okay.
are off the hook.
Great.
Um,
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your time.
yep. Thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, and we look forward to presenting to you again soon. Take care, everybody.